Last year, the IMF director and the heads of several central banks met in Davos. They discussed the proposed future of currencies, CBDCs. Those are centralized bank digital currencies. They're kind of like cryptocurrencies, but without the privacy. They're digital currencies where every single transaction is tracked and regulated by a central power. They can cancel it, they can cancel you. China already has one in place. And there's a push now for the whole world to follow, including at the Federal Reserve right here in the United States. Here to speak with us about it is Thomas Hogan. He's Senior Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and the former Chief Economist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Hey, Thomas Hogan, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be on.
Well, you know, people are pretty worried right now about CBDCs. What are some of the concerns around digital currencies?
Yeah, that's right. So the central banks around the world have started introducing central bank digital currencies, which in many cases are just an electronic version of the currencies that their governments control already. But they really go a lot further because once they are offering the public these digital currencies, then the central bank has some information about what the public is doing, what they're spending their money on, and has some control about what people are and are not able to spend their money on. And so that seems pretty dangerous. It's not sure we want that power in the government's hands.
Yeah, well, I don't. But, you know, it looks like the Federal Reserve and central banks pretty much around the world right now are looking to adopt them. You know, for these centralized banks, what are the interests in CBDCs? Like, why would they actually want them?
Right. So, you know, there are a couple of reasons. One is a rather benign reason that they say that their monetary policies will be more effective. Typically, the Federal Reserve, you know, the central bank of the United States, they manage the money supply by buying and selling bonds and raising and lowering interest rates. And so rather than buying and selling bonds and putting money into financial markets, they could just directly inject that money into people's bank accounts, essentially, their accounts with the central bank digital currency. However, that would also mean that they would have the ability to take money out of people's bank accounts, essentially. And so although that would be more efficient, it would potentially be problematic. It also, as we said, gives them more control to monitor what people are doing with their money.
And I can't see them giving us money personally. Who knows? You know, last year was said that 9 of the 10 major central banks were already exploring the use of CBDCs. Why are they, you know, where are they at in terms of actually adopting these things? Like, how close are we to actually having these around the world?
Yeah, that's right. So all the major central banks are exploring this and have some kind of pilot program or test program, and they're at varying degrees of completion right now. So a number of smaller countries have introduced CBDCs, and they've mostly been failures. Iceland had one, Nigeria had one, the city of Miami had one. China's is the only one that's really been widely used, and that's just because China has so much power over its citizens. It's already controlling all of their financial companies and their internet companies. And so that's the only area where it's really been widely used. In the United States, it's really just kind of an idea at this time. And in fact, the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, has said that he doesn't believe the Fed has the right, the legal ability to offer one directly to U.S. citizens. He believes that right now they would only be allowed to offer it to banks. And so it really wouldn't have the same powers and things that we're afraid of from a central bank digital currency. But that's something that the Fed might change their mind, or Congress might authorize them to do that.
Yeah, you know, we saw them roll out FedNow just recently. A lot of people, myself included, were saying, hey, this is a precursor to CBDCs. You know, they're arguing it's only for transactions between banks. They're like, oh, it's not a CBDC, quit accusing us of it. But if you look at their videos, they state clearly that that FedNow is designed and intended to compete with China's CBDC. And they also say that it can replace the need for a CBDC. So, like, what are we supposed to make of FedNow? What is it, and what's the intent behind it, as far as you see it?
Yeah, that's right. So right now, FedNow is just for transferring money between banks. And so it's intended to make the transfer system a little bit more efficient. So the traditional transfers between banks, they take a long time. You have to wait several days. And so this is now a system where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can transfer money and you don't have to wait a long time for it. Of course, part of the reason that they're waiting is, legal reasons, and has nothing to do with actual technology itself. And so even though this technology is a little bit more efficient, it's not clear that there's a big benefit there. But the question would be if they tried to enhance this to make it something where the Fed was actually intervening in the system. Like right now, it's only transfers between banks. But if the Fed were to try to use it to, deposit money into those banks, or take money out of those banks, then it would be a little bit more like a central bank digital currency. But they've already got a system to do that already, so it really wouldn't be much different than what they've got now.
Yeah, well, one of the big concerns with this is debanking. Nigel Farage in the UK is saying he was debanked. A lot of people, even in the US, have had their bank accounts canceled, allegedly because of their political speech and so on. What happens if the banks can not only control people's accounts, but even control transactions? What does that mean?
Yeah, you're right. It's scary. I mean, this push has been going on for decades already to get people away from cash and to take away their ability to use cash so that the government can have more control over their transactions. And of course, that idea sounds nice, but it's kind of based on two false assumptions. One is that people that use cash are only criminals, right? And that's definitely not true. Some people either for people with lower incomes can't afford to be in the banking system or just choose not to. But it also assumes that the government is trustworthy in managing all those payments and managing your information. And they've proven that they can't do it. As you mentioned, the Nigel Farage situation in Canada when there was the truckers' protest last year and the government moved to take people's money from their bank accounts. And in the United States, we've had a history of that as well. Not quite the same, but pressuring banks to lend to certain companies and not to others. Operation Choke Point under the Obama administration was where the regulators pressured banks, even though it was not illegal, not to lend to firearm companies and tobacco companies and to industries that were just politically unpopular. And so we've seen that the government will take it upon themselves to use that power in a way that is good for them and not good for the American people. And so it's dangerous to want to give them that power.
Yeah, well, we talked a bit about FedNow, and they've also talked about how built within the technology are things they could use to create a CBDC in the future as well. So it does work as kind of a foundational technology. But another thing we're seeing is new regulations on cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and such. I know the government just rolled out some new regulations on it. And another big concern is that even if the government does not directly control digital currencies, including currently existing ones, they can create new policies which establish oversight, then use the regulatory system, which has a slow creep, to begin creating new regulations. Is this far-fetched? How do you interpret what's happening with government regulations on things like Bitcoin?
Right. No, I think that is already happening. It's not far-fetched at all. So I just mentioned the Operation Choke Point that had happened in the Obama administration. Many people are calling the current stance on crypto to be Operation Choke Point 2.0, because even though it's not illegal for banks to be working with cryptocurrencies or allowing people to buy and sell them through the banks, the regulators are treating that like it's illegal, and they're just pressuring the banks. They're not actually making any clear law or saying that this is illegal. They're just telling the banks, hey, you shouldn't do this and you're going to be penalized if you do, even though it's technically not illegal. And so this is just another case where they're already using their discretionary powers to do things to punish industries that they don't like. And it's something that is a purely political step. It's not illegal. There are no clear rules about it. It's just the government using their power to enforce their political views.
I know some people would argue we'll never see a digital currency. It needs congressional approval. Congress, I don't know, maybe they would agree on it. Where do you see Congress at with this? Because I know they do need congressional approval to get it through in terms of where you see Republicans and Democrats falling.
Right. Yeah. So Fed Chair Jerome Powell has said that the Fed currently doesn't have the power to offer a retail CBDC to regular citizens, but they could only do a wholesale to the banking system. So on one hand, that's comforting because at least the Fed is acknowledging that they don't have the full power right now. On the other hand, that's just Powell's opinion. And what we've seen over the last couple of years in the pandemic recovery is the Fed going beyond what people thought it was legally allowed to do. And so it's not very comforting that that's just his opinion. You know, in terms of the bailouts that they did to state and local governments and to non-bank financial companies in the pandemic recovery, those are things the Fed is not allowed to do, but they did it anyway. You know, some of the QE and the other things that the Fed is doing right now, the climate change regulations, all these new things that they're really not allowed to do, but they're doing it anyway. And so on one hand, it's comforting that Powell would say that. On the other hand, he could change his mind, or we might have political pressure to replace him with someone who is a more political Fed chair that would be willing to have the Fed go into those areas that they're really not supposed to be in.
Yeah, well, who's ever heard of government expanding its powers, right?
Right. Yeah. Totally predictable. But
my
still
big thought is,
unfortunate
again,
nonetheless.
regulatory creep, that they might use the the regulatory state to try to advance it and bypass Congress through that. But we'll see what they end up doing. Another big thing is internationally. You mentioned a lot of other countries had adopted it. Nigeria, for example. You said a lot of those countries have kind of since abandoned it. If I remember right, it's because a lot of them, people just didn't want it. I know that in Australia and in the UK, they're now trying to roll it out. What are you seeing with this? And are they learning from the mistakes of other countries?
Right. So, if a government's going to introduce this new electronic currency system, there are only two ways that it would be widely used. One is if it's a really good system that people want to use. We haven't seen that anywhere in any of the countries, that it's not really any better and people want to use it. The other way is that if they are so forceful and so powerful, like in the case of China, that they can essentially force the citizens to use it. And so really, China is the only country that's been able to get widespread adoption in that way. A lot of other countries have tried. Nigeria has been trying to pressure its people to use their central bank digital currency, but it hasn't been able to. And a lot of the other ones have failed, for that same reason. It's not clear if the U.S. did try to do a central bank digital currency. The dollar is widely used in international transactions. And even though, in America, we're upset about all the inflation that we've been having, in most countries, it's much worse. And so it's possible that if the US dollar had a CBDC, it might be more widely used abroad in countries that don't have a stable central bank where they can rely on it. As bad as our situation is, it's not as bad as what's going on elsewhere. But it would still be, a remarkably strong move if the US were to try to expand that. I don't know if in the UK or Australia those will get any traction, but they do have a little bit more stable central banks than a lot of the other countries that have tried this already. And so who knows, maybe the citizens would be more willing to use an electronic version if they weren't afraid that the government were going to manipulate it or be tracking them in the way that China is doing.
Important stuff. Hey, Thomas Hogan, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be on.